You're listening to Cover Your Assets, a podcast that discusses the timely and significant legal issues faced by employers. Kathleen Jennings is an attorney who has over 30 years of experience in advising employers as to their legal responsibilities and has written extensively about employment law in her popular Cover Your Assets blog. If your business has employees, you cannot afford not to have your assets covered.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cover Your Assets. The Cover Your Assets. Where did how about just Cover Your Assets? I knew there was a "the" in there somewhere. Labor and Employment Law Podcast, featuring myself, your host, Thom Jennings, and of course, as mentioned in our lovely intro, which I still don't know if that's what we paid for the intro through a service called Fiverr. And I don't know if that's an actual human being or if that's AI. What's your take on it, resident expert Kathleen Jennings?
Well, hey, Tom, how are you doing this great Labor Day? And Labor Day is a great day to be talking about labor and employment. To answer your question, it doesn't really matter because I think it sounds good. So that's really the most important feature, that we like the sound of it. At least I like the sound of it. Do you not like the sound of it?
Well, if there's anybody out there listening, we'll solicit some feedback, because I don't know. I listen to a lot of podcasts.
I know.
And the intros are either like these big and bold. I think the sports ones are kind of big and bold, and then some of them they just launch right into it. They just have a little bit of music at the front end, and then they launch into the podcast without any lengthy intro. But I don't know. I sometimes I just like to change things up, but we'll keep it the same intro for now. But I'm definitely thinking about changing it up.
Okay. Well, whatever you think is best, you are the producer.
Whatever is going to launch us into the labor and employment law stratosphere in terms of ratings, which right now
There you go.
we're not quite in the stratosphere. We're in the lowest sphere, whatever that is.
Well, we'll just keep at it because I think people are finding our podcast useful and hopefully a little bit entertaining, as we like to talk about every week.
Absolutely. And so last week, if you didn't have a chance to listen to the episode, it was a very popular topic. It's one that's, I guess what the kids say, is trending. It's been trending on all the social media platforms, a subject called quiet quitting. And of course, when you have a subject that's trending, usually somebody has to find a different angle on it. So I found an article recently about a newer trend. Well, it's not really a newer trend. Again, we're just kind of naming things that were going on because quiet quitting was going on before we called it quiet quitting. But it's called quiet firing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. On Labor Day, of all days, we're going to talk about quiet firing.
I don't know if that's really appropriate, but I guess that's our topic. So let's have at it.
It is. And I don't know if there's statistics out there, but if you think about it, the days that people get fired most often, Labor Day would be one of the least amount of times people would get fired throughout the year, because it's typically a day off, right?
It is. So that is a good point.
That is a good point. So
Great point.
Quiet quitting, just for a recap, was, well, you know what? Let's not recap. Let's just make people go back into the archives and listen themselves. We shouldn't have to repeat ourselves. This isn't Batman where you have the previous episode bleeding into the second one, is it?
No, we are not Batman. At least you are not Batman.
I am not. But quiet firing is a topic that is, as we discussed a little bit off air, in many ways, it's probably a topic that is more significant and something that you would have to be very aware of as an employer, because it would expose you to more legal, or is it legal exposure? What's the terminology I'm looking for, lawyer?
It could expose you to liability.
And I'll give you a quick summary. Quiet firing. So quiet quitting, we know what that is. Quiet firing is when the employer on the other end does things to kind of unmotivate or demotivate. I'm not sure which term is more proper, but we'll use both of them. An employee. And this can be done in very subtle ways, or maybe some not so subtle ways. But either way, it's going to create a disgruntled employee. And what do we know about disgruntled employees?
We know that disgruntled employees are not productive employees, and they tend to be employees who are going to look for another job.
And there could also be somebody, they're going to be the one that initiates a lawsuit. They could be somebody that starts union activity, any of those things.
Well, those are the worst case scenarios. You're absolutely right, Tom.
So quiet firing, one of the components of it is, and we'll drill these down to individual methods and kind of discuss those and go through them. And I've dealt with pretty much all of them, surprisingly, not surprisingly. We'll start with the promotions. So within an organization, every organization handles promotions differently. If a position comes up, you can either hire externally, internally. Of course, if it's an external hire, it's not technically a promotion, it's just a hire. But when you have a position that opens, probably the first thing most companies would want to do would be to work within the organization to promote somebody who's already demonstrated that they can be good at a lower position and then promote them to a higher position. Now, if an organization chooses to forego promotions for a certain type of employees or whatever, this could create an atmosphere which is basically a method of quiet firing. Now, when it comes to hiring practices and promotions and positions that come up, I mean, what's your suggestion in terms of the best way to handle it as an employer?
Well, from a legal perspective, you want to handle these positions in a way that doesn't generate claims of discrimination on the basis of any protected characteristic. So you want to make sure that you're not promoting just white men or just white women or just a certain class of people to positions, or hiring from outside of the organization to put them in these higher positions. You want to make sure that there's not a pattern of discrimination. And if you do have a policy of promoting from within, it's probably best to have some kind of posting policy so that interested employees can apply for promotions or really any other position in the organization. Because if these positions are given out, or the notice of these positions is done by word of mouth, sometimes you'll see a discrimination claim because the word of mouth may be going within a certain protected or certain unprotected group of people, rather than making sure that everybody in the organization is aware of the opening.
And I would think that a common scenario, at least in my experience, what I've seen is one of the protected classes that you didn't mention is one near and dear to my heart, and that's age discrimination. And employers, a lot of times, especially when they're trying to fill a higher position, they may hire somebody that's out of college or younger for economic reasons. I mean, the reality is, if you're going to hire somebody that has a lot of experience, as opposed to somebody that's just out of college, the person just out of college, they're probably going to be cheaper, especially if they don't have a family or any of those types of things. But I would imagine that if that becomes a pattern, you really could open yourself up to an age discrimination lawsuit, even though, again, the practical reason may be it's more economical for us to hire younger people or women. So if you have a woman of childbearing age, maybe you don't promote her because she's pregnant. And that has to be a form of discrimination, isn't it?
It is. It is, absolutely. When you make your promotion decisions, the decisions should be based upon the qualifications of the candidates, and you should ideally promote the person who is the best qualified for that position, not the person who is the lowest salary for the position necessarily, but you want to have the best qualified person. So if you hire that college kid right out of college and pass over an employee that's been with your organization a number of years and has a good track record with the organization, then the older employee is possibly going to claim that they were more qualified and were not placed in that position because of their age.
Yeah, and oftentimes, I mean, I've heard of this situation happening, so I know it's fairly common, is that you'll bring in this younger employee at higher pay, at a higher level within the organization, and then the one that's been there that's longer has to train them. They basically have to help train their supervisor. And that's a situation that I just don't ever see working out for anybody.
Well, unless that younger employee is someone who really does have better qualifications, sometimes maybe they have a degree that the older employee or existing employee doesn't have that is necessary for the job. So it's not always going to be discrimination, but you need to look at the relative qualifications. And if it looks like the older employee really does have a better performance or a better idea of how to handle that job than the younger one, then you may have a problem. And you're going to breed resentment not only in that older employee, but other employees in the organization who see someone who's been passed over uh, that they consider to be a good performer and a good employee and maybe even a friend.
Yeah, and you also touched on some things that I think are important to reiterate, is that the process itself, there has to be something within that process that is defensible. So, for example, you have, and correct me if I'm wrong, you got your white male, you got your pregnant female, you've got your older female. Okay, so you've got two in a protected class, one not in a protected class, but of the three, only the white male has a master's degree, and maybe in the particular area that this position requires, or at least was. I know sometimes they say minimum requirements are this, but we prefer, minimum requirement is a bachelor's degree. We would really prefer if you had a master's. So this guy has the master's degree. Now, I would assume that would be defensible because you could say, well, I mean, really, the tipping point was the education component as opposed to as opposed to any potential discrimination. Whereas if all three had similar education, similar amount of work experience, I believe that's where you could start getting into a little bit of trouble if there's a pattern of just hiring white males. And can I say, because, as somebody who was a white male and not in an age protected class for a long time, there's a lot of white males out there that feel really resentful, and we'll just say it because it's something that has to be identified. They feel that they're getting pushed out of positions just based on the fact that they're not within a protected class. And not to get political or idealistic, but
I think you already did.
well, I did, but I mean, the reality is that a lot of times it may appear that way, but it's not the case. There's still plenty of opportunities and plenty of jobs for everyone within this market. And there's a difference between protecting a group and in reality, I think everybody's protected in some way, shape, or form. So this isn't one of those things where, we're targeting companies not to hire white males. If you have a white male that is the most qualified for the position, and you can rightfully say that the reason that you're hiring them is based on the qualifications and not their gender and not their age or any of those types of things, then you should feel confident that you're hiring the right person.
I agree, Tom. And white males can assert discrimination claims just like any other group of people.
Have you run into that at all? Because again, I think that's one of those things where people think, a white male can't be, but I mean, a white male could always make claims of retaliation. Say if they made a complaint that they weren't hired because they were a white male and somebody was hired because they were in a protected class.
Well, you have to remember that statutes like Title VII protect discrimination on the basis of race, sex, national origin. Well, national origin is Section 1981, and also Title VII. So it doesn't protect any one particular race. It protects people from all race discrimination or discrimination on the basis of race. So if race is being used as a way to choose people for a promotion, then that could be discrimination, because if less qualified people are being passed over, then you have a problem.
And there was a case actually at a place where I used to work, and the case didn't happen while I was working there. It was actually before I worked there, where a group of white employees all got together because the head of this organization was African American, and they said that the only people that got promoted were African Americans. So there you go. It does happen. But let's shift gears now, because I think we've kind of flogged that one, that topic a little bit, and we've certainly discussed it on other podcasts as well. But the other component of quiet firing, which can be difficult and really cause a great deal of resentment, and I've experienced this, is where you just don't give out raises for extended periods of time. Now, there are situations where organizations like not-for-profits or even a for-profit organization is just struggling and they can't give out raises. So you have to communicate that to the workforce, and most places do, but where you start to run into problems is if your workforce's pay rate is fairly stable, and then you start to see turnover, and then you're having to bring in new people, and you start bringing in new people at a higher rate of pay than the people that have been there for 4 or 5 years. And that's not good.
Well, and that's a situation I think that a lot of employers are struggling with right now in this particular job market, because they need to spend more money and offer more money in order to attract good talent. And in some cases, maybe that money is more than what the existing employees are making, because they were hired during a time when unemployment may have been higher. So that way the labor costs weren't as high to attract that good talent. And that does create a problem. And now, as we've talked about in other podcasts, you have to be aware that employees can and will talk about how much money they're making, and they'll compare notes. And so your existing folks are going to find out that the new folks may be making more money, or they may even see it in a job posting somewhere that more money is being offered than what they're making. So that is absolutely a problem. And again, you have to make sure that when you do this, it's not going to be a basis for a discrimination suit. So you don't want to offer more money to people of a certain group and maybe think, well, I can get these other folks in a different group for less money.
Yeah, and I would think that this would be something that would, more so than the promotion component, this would be something that could ignite that organized labor activity within the workplace. Because really, if you get down to it, one of the key components of a union is they negotiate pay rates. And I've been on both ends of the perspective, where exact same job, exact same expectations. One was a non-union, and I was there for 7 years with no raises. And my current employer, I've been there for 2.5 years, and I've had bonuses, raises, additional pay that I have to get for doing extra work, all those types of things. So there you go. I mean, if it comes down to the point where people feel that they're not being treated fairly as a group for the same amount of work, or there's larger expectations on one group than others, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well in terms of the whole quiet firing thing, putting more work on certain individuals and not paying them more, which really is even worse than not giving them a raise, is not giving them a raise and expecting more out of them. And that really has that, if you look at the quiet quitting, that's been the basis of a lot of people quietly quitting. They're saying, hey, you don't want to pay me more money, but you want to get more work out of me because we're in a tight labor market.
Yeah, and I like how you have that whole quiet quitting dovetailing into the quiet firing. That was well done.
Dovetailing. I like that. That's the first time we've ever used that term on this podcast.
It is. You like that?
I did.
Right.
I couldn't, it's not a term I use very often, but do you ever have words that just sort of show up and you haven't used them in a long time? So I'm probably just going to throw that in a sentence over the next couple of weeks, just randomly.
Be my guest. Yeah.
But truly, though, they really are. I mean, this is where quiet firing and quiet quitting, in some ways, these last two podcast episodes are very complementary because one can breed the other.
They can. And I think it's also important for employers to recognize that you don't want to, well, quiet firing is basically a passive aggressive way of trying to get rid of people, I think is how we could sum it up, by basically not giving an employee rewards that you normally would. Pass them over for promotions. You don't give them pay raises. Maybe you give them to other employees. But at some point, you have to be aware that quiet firing could turn into constructive discharge, which is an actionable legal claim, which is defined as making a work environment so awful that someone has no choice but to quit. Now that's when you start making things really uncomfortable. Those claims come out a lot in sexual harassment situations, perhaps. But it could be if the boss is just piling on one employee, maybe the boss is screaming at this person, which we've talked about bad bosses and bullying, not a good thing. Or this whole passive aggressive approach is really not ideal. If you have an employee that is not working out, then you really need to address it head on and deal with the situation. Either help them try to improve the performance, put them on a performance improvement plan, and if improvement doesn't happen, they know the consequences. But this passive aggressive approach, I think, is not ideal.
And we've discussed that on plenty of previous episodes, so hopefully some of that's sinking into our regular listeners. But here's the final one, and this one's very pertinent to what's going on in the workplace now. And it's kind of an odd one. There's some nuances to it, and we discussed this off air as well. It's right now, a lot of employers are trying to bring employees back into the office, and so they're incentivizing them. And actually, this can be done in the hiring process too. So, for example, if you hire somebody and you give them $1,000 sign-on bonus, that goes back to the whole pay discussion that we had. So with $1,000 bonus, if this person lasts 2 or 3 months, ultimately they're getting paid more than the people that have been there for 15 years. Okay. So if you're going to have those types of programs, be aware there's probably going to be some pushback, and maybe you should come up with a program for your current employees that at least acknowledges the fact that, hey, yes, we're giving out $1,000 bonuses to the new employees, but we're able to give you, I don't know, I'd say extra vacation days, any of those types of things, some kind of reward to an employee that's been there a little bit longer to kind of offset that pain that employees are feeling. But having these incentives and giving things to people that are coming back into the office, what that article that we read said basically was, you're breeding some resentment. So if I've been sitting in the office for 3 years and all of a sudden you come back to work to the office and they got a bunch of balloons, a $500 gift card to Kohl's or whatever, if there's Kohl's across the nation, I assume there is, but any department store or Amazon for that matter. I don't know. It's the prodigal son analogy. You're going to sit back and go, wait a minute, what about me? I've been kicking around for 3 years, busting my butt in the office, and now all of a sudden this guy shows up, and the last time we saw him was on a Zoom screen, and I don't even know if that was a cardboard cutout of him. But
wow,
why are you so happy that they're here today?
Well, and by full disclosure, I have been working remotely for over 15 years. So I am one of those long-term remote workers. So I understand.
You're working remotely on this podcast. In fact, last week was the first time that you actually showed up in person. So
I know, and I didn't receive
no
any
bonuses,
gifts,
nothing
no
special,
bonus, nothing, no balloon. I would have accepted a bagel.
A bagel,
nothing. A bagel, nothing. Got nothing.
You got egg bagels, but that was for something. That was for my sister.
Not for showing up for the podcast. Yeah, no, I got nothing. In fact, there was no air conditioning in the room. Even it was little uncomfortable. But anyway, so yes, that when you start, employers are struggling with trying to attract people back into the office because a lot of folks worked remotely during the pandemic, got used to it, got comfortable with it. And now employers want them back in the office because they feel like it just creates a better team atmosphere. Everybody's there, you can see what they're doing, and not everyone wants to come back. And speaking as someone who has worked from remotely as a long time, I get that. Although remote work isn't for everyone. So you do have to be careful about showing appreciation for the folks that have been there the whole time and not go overboard in welcoming back the remote workers. Or even sometimes you'll see some folks are allowed to work remotely, maybe part of the time now. But there are some folks whose jobs require them to be at the office all the time. A receptionist or somebody that has to actually greet the public. And so you want to make sure that you show those folks that you appreciate the fact that they do come to work every day and they're there on time and they're the face of the organization. And maybe you have bring in lunch one day a week for the folks that are there, or show appreciation another way. I know some employers were doing that during the pandemic for the folks that really did have to come into the office.
Yeah. And I'll tell you a story, family story, pre-pandemic. My wife, we had a family member that was diagnosed with a very serious illness. And my wife wanted having to be a caretaker and help the family. And her employer was flexible enough to let her work remotely for 2 days, 1 week, 3 days the following week, and then split time with, another family member that was helping. And to me, that's the kind of flexibility that you need. And in those situations, other employees, in many ways, that sends a message that says, hey, we care about you. We're willing to be flexible, those types of things. So you're right. I think now things are a little different because, again, you had the whole pandemic thing, and there's a little different in terms of expectations for remote work. But if there is a situation where an employee can work remotely for 1 or 2 days a week, and again, you really touched on another subject or something that's very important. It's not for everybody. On some level, you have to have that kind of hard discussion with the employee and say, look, I know you want to work remotely, because some people think working remotely means, I'm home. I don't have to do as much work. But there's probably, I know from when I took classes remotely in college, and this is in 2008, 2009, that there was more work for the remote students than there were the ones that came in. So as an employer, you almost have to create the expectations that, yeah, you can work remotely, but you're going to actually have to do more than the people that come into the office. Does that make sense, or am I kind of veering off into the stratosphere again?
I think you're veering off into the stratosphere a little bit, Tom, and that's okay. You're happy there, so we'll let you hang out there. I think, what the pandemic has done is show many employers that remote work can be done, or that some jobs can be performed remotely. And so now employers are making choices as to whether do we want to keep some of these folks remotely all the time or working remotely all the time? Do we want everybody back in the office? And then there's going to be issues there may be folks who have a disability. And we've talked about this in our reasonable accommodation episode. Maybe working remotely is a reasonable accommodation for them. And if they've been successfully working remotely and there's no other barriers to it, then it is an accommodation that may have to be considered. So, as we've said before, for a lot of issues, it's not a one size fits all problem. It's you have to exercise some discretion, and at the end of the day, you need to be fair, but you also need to be aware of certain legal requirements, such as the reasonable accommodation.
Yeah. And that may be a topic for another podcast episode, because in terms of reasonable accommodation, a lot of people are using mental health issues, Is that a reasonable accommodation, or is it just somebody trying to work remotely? But ultimately, some people are really good at working remotely and maybe better employees remotely than they are in the office, and vice versa. So there has to be a bit of a balance there too. But these are all very delicate situations, and you just have to approach them on a kind of case by case basis. But before we get to our takeaways, I think that the takeaways seem to be the same in pretty much every episode, is that it all comes down to fairness. You have to be fair with your employees, and fairness is not always equal. It's fairness. So those are the things that you have to make sure that you're addressing within the workplace. So with that nice little transition, takeaways.
I would say quiet firing is not the ideal way to treat your employees. Being passive aggressive in that way could lead to resentment, which could lead to EEOC charges, possible union organization, or just bad morale in your office. So it's not the best idea.
Just don't do it. As opposed to Nike, which says just do it.
Well, we're not here to promote other brands, bro.
Right.
But if you wanted to say that, you could. But no, it's as we've talked about on a lot of these podcasts, you want to deal with employee issues head on, directly, and honestly. And to me, quiet firing seems a bit cowardly and a little bit dishonest. So it's not a good look.
Absolutely. And as far as Nike, if they do want to sponsor us, they're not a sponsor, but we would happily take their sponsor dollars, or any reasonable organization, not any organization, because, hey, not everybody's a good fit for our particular podcast. But if you want to sponsor us, let me know. Speaking of that, contact information, if they would like to utilize your legal services, Ms. Jennings.
You can reach out to me via email at kjj@wimlaw, WIMLAW.com.
See, and I didn't do that last week, and she gave me a little bit of grief about that, because that's that's part of the point of the podcast is,
Yeah, no contact information, no balloons, no gifts.
Nothing. No air
there
conditioning.
There I was, no air conditioning, and there I was. So that's why I'm remote this week, because I have air conditioning. I have central air conditioning.
Yes, that's a reasonable accommodation. Very reasonable.
Yes. At least in Southeast Georgia it is. Yes.
All right. Well, as always, sis, I'd much rather have you in this non-air conditioned room, but it's always good to see you via Zoom, and proving once again that people can work remotely together and still create a fantastic product. And with that being said, I will thank you once again for listening. Please consider sharing. We love reviews if you can put them out there. We love topic suggestions, all that kind of good stuff. And as always, thank you from the bottom of our heart for listening to the Cover Your Assets podcast. We'll see you next week.